Welcome to another episode of Husch Blackwell's False Claims Act Insights podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Porter. In most industries, the way that people are compensated is pretty straightforward. You think about the value that they bring to the business, and that largely governs how compensation works. For those who are involved in healthcare, they know that is not the way it works in healthcare. Healthcare has all of these guardrails up to make sure that only the right productivity measures are being included in deals and physician compensation and other things. And there's a bunch of reasons for all of that. But getting the language right, getting the talking points right when you're doing deals, when you're talking about physician compensation, those are common stumbling blocks that a lot of smart people at our firm think a lot about. And so what we're going to talk about on the podcast today is that very topic, how we can talk about the financial side of healthcare without crossing any sort of compliance lines. Joining me to talk about that important issue is my law partner, Hal Katz. Hal is a partner in Husch Blackwell's Austin, Texas office, former ABA Health Law Section Chairman. Hal and I, actually, this is a bit of a special episode because Hal and I tomorrow are going to talk about this very topic at the American Alliance of Orthopedic Executives Conference in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we're picking up on that conference, going into a little bit more depth, talking about these really important things, how these topics, how talking about healthcare in deals and the financial side of healthcare in deals can result in some compliance problems. And so, Hal, thanks for joining me in Louisville, and thanks for joining me on the podcast for this little bonus episode of the podcast. I appreciate you, Hal.
Oh, Jonathan, thank you. You know, it's always my pleasure to join you. You are my favorite podcaster, just for the record.
I appreciate that, Hal. So, Hal, why don't you set this up for us? Because I think people hear the open and they maybe are a little puzzled. Why does it matter what people put in writing in healthcare deals?
Great question. Great way to kick us off, Jonathan. Let us frame this as a reminder. There are two standards in business. There's one standard for pretty much every business out there, and that is what makes good financial sense. How do we grow the business? What do we need to do? And put that in place, and you're pretty much in good shape. There's a separate standard for the healthcare industry, and that's because there's a belief that individuals should not be rewarded financially for business that they generate. That's the whole kickback for referrals. So we have that whole regulatory scheme, both at a federal level and a state level, that we have to be mindful of in healthcare. Here specifically, we need to make sure that when we set compensation, when we negotiate a purchase price, when we try and grow business for the medical group, the surgery center, the ancillary services, that we are doing it in a proper way and we are using words to describe the comp model, the growing the business strategy, and the purchase price that comply with those federal and state requirements.
Thanks, Hal. And so just so our listeners know, when we're talking about the anti-kickback statute and the Stark law, which is another prohibition against dollars sort of influencing what physicians do, it's not at all clear. So a lot of laws, you understand what is illegal and what is fine. And the anti-kickback statute and the Stark law, where there's a ton of confusion around them. And so that's why people like Hal spend their days thinking about how to structure these things in compliant ways. And really what we're talking about here is not necessarily how to structure it in a compliant way. It's making sure everyone understands that we're doing this in a compliant way. Because sometimes when people don't understand that and they think that perhaps something's going wrong, there are some enforcement problems. And so, Hal, let's talk about those. To me, when I think about this issue, there's a spectrum of egregiousness. So on one end, you have people who know what they're doing is illegal and they do it anyway. So for example, there was a criminal case in your neck of the woods, Texas, just a few years ago where physicians owned a hospital with the plan to, quote, buy surgeries, but to cover up those bought surgeries with fake consulting contracts. That's one end of the spectrum. But on the other end, there's the recent DOJ Stark intervention against a Tennessee health system where it appears that there were legitimate efforts to fairly value physician compensation, but the financial team, I guess, didn't fully comprehend the stark implications of how and why things were being structured. And the financial team made some statements about the downstream financial benefits of a deal that ended up in a DOJ complaint. So Hal, What are some best practices for those involved in the physician compensation discussions? How can health systems and physician groups get alignment on deals and hopefully avoid getting the finance team quoted in a future DOJ False Claims Act complaint?
So as far as best practices go, the first thing I would recommend is everybody slow down. There should not be a rush to make a change to the comp plan. There should not be a rush just to try and increase productivity at a surgery center. The management team needs to be thoughtful in how they address these issues. If it's around a comp plan change, make sure you have the right experts, specialists to identify what changes should be made to the comp plan and how to communicate them. Communicate them formally in meetings, document the discussion in the meeting, what the concern is with the comp plan, what the options are for changing the comp plan, the basis for changing that comp plan, and at each stage, making sure that those align with the requirements for compensation methodologies, for increasing productivity at the surgery center. But there's no issue with trying to grow the business. It's really around how you message growing the business and being more productive. That's really what especially physicians or management teams within physician organizations need to remember.
Yeah, great points, Hal. You mentioned the basis for comp and methodologies for comp. So let's go there next. A decade ago, right on the heels of the big Tuomey trial, and I think a lot of people in healthcare remember the big Tuomey trial. It's the trial that literally ended a health system over Stark violations. So right after that, there was another hospital, this one in Florida, that was heading towards a trial against DOJ. And they saw Tuomey and they said, we don't want that. We'd like to settle this. And so they settled that case. The issue there was the math itself for calculating comp. It included drugs that were filled at the hospital, tests that were run at the hospital, things that you can't base comp on under Stark, what we call designated health services. You can't do that under Stark. But in a lot of orthopedic groups, how there's no formula for comp. It can be more of a black box. And when that black box comp gets questioned, there are a bunch of people scrutinizing whether the appropriate metrics were the basis for comp or whether some inappropriate metrics snuck into the comp calculation. So Hal, give our listeners some best practices for thinking about comp when it comes to that.
Jonathan, first of all, the doctors and the management team have to be very familiar with what can be included when setting a compensation formula. That's number one, because number two, you've got to be able to clearly explain what the payment was for, why that amount for what you were paying, who approved it, and whether it was applied consistently across all physicians. I mean, those are some fundamental principles that have to be met when it comes to setting compensation going forward.
Thanks, Hal. Yeah, that's something that I worry about is when you have a black box compensation model and you really can't understand how the numbers work, what's stopping DOJ from coming back with perfect hindsight is 2020 vision saying, you can't tell us how the numbers work, but it sure looks to us like people who refer a lot to the ASC, they're getting a lot more money than the people who don't. And so it looks to us like you're rewarding people for something that is profitable to yourself. That's where I get worried. And so I think it's always good to have a methodology. And so, Hal, I'm glad that you walked us through that a little bit. You know, something that we're not going to cover at our AAOE talk is the role of private equity investment in healthcare. And I think this dovetails nicely with our topic because when you've got PE backing in healthcare, the PE owners or investors, they're thinking a lot about the finances of healthcare. One thing that impacts the finances of healthcare is where downstream referrals go. And so sometimes you hear words in healthcare like leakage or phrases like keeping procedures. Hal, could you explain why that tension exists in healthcare and how strong organizations can find ways to talk about financial realities without crossing a compliance line?
Jonathan, that tension point is real. Where services occur affects the economics. Everybody understands that. And private equity is focused on earnings, utilization, predictability. Even medical groups are thinking about growth, access, facility utilization. The issue is not acknowledging that. That's not the problem. The issue is how it gets translated into incentives, into compensation, into language that's used to manage the physicians and the others who are providing the services, generating the revenue. That's really the struggle. What we see is for strong groups, focusing on capacity, focusing on access, operational efficiency, framing the business issues around those concepts, those three concepts, is where we think successful groups do it right, or how successful groups do it right. Where it gets, what I would say, risky is when the conversation starts to shift into where cases should go, either for ancillary services or facility services, and how those kind of referral patterns result in better returns, or how it improves volumes, how volumes stay within the practice or within the own facility. That's where we see the problems arise. Where the language starts to create exposure is really where management has to step in, when physicians are doing their best to talk about these things, but don't appreciate how it has to be talked about and has to be thought about. It's not just talk, it's thought, because we're talking about intent. That's a very important role for management.
Thanks, Hal. And that's where I think folks like the orthopedic executives that we're talking to tomorrow, I think that's where they come in, because it's their job to make sure that there are guardrails up, to make sure that the words that people are using are aligned with the intent of the organization. And so that's why I'm glad that we're doing this, Hal, is because the words that people use, and specifically management of a physician group, that's their job to make sure that the right guardrails are up. So Hal, let's end with some proactive tips for our listeners. Let's say we've got a listener worried about saying the wrong things, and they want to take some concrete steps today to get on better compliance footing. What can they do, Hal? What are some compliance guardrails that healthcare organizations need to be thinking about and implementing? And why are those compliance guardrails good investments for healthcare organizations?
Jonathan, I'd say the first most important step is to slow down. Management, leadership, they are overwhelmed with everything on their plate, all of their responsibilities. And often this is just one of many other responsibilities that they're just trying to push through and implement. But this is one area where I would strongly recommend they slow down and they really think about the things that we've been discussing. So when they're formulating that email, when they're having a meeting discussing a proposed change in compensation methodology, or trying to increase productivity at the surgery center, they don't cut the discussion short by saying, we need more referrals to the surgery center. They need to be thoughtful and frame it the way we've been discussing in order to avoid that risk that they're going to be scrutinized and they're going to be seen as rewarding the owners or the physicians for those referrals. So think about their words, think about their documentation. What are they putting in presentations? What are they putting in their minutes? How's everybody talking about that? I'd say those are my strong recommendations. And pulling in, of course, legal counsel when they're making any changes to compensation plans, ownership requirements. I would say those are very important steps. Now, why is this so important? Well, it is very hard to explain to someone down the road, let's say a regulator, law enforcement, a whistleblower, attorney, what was written down in a document. They're going to get a one-dimensional view of what you did based on what they read on paper or what they see in reports. And it's going to be very challenging to tell a different story than what they see produced in those documents. And a little bit of front-end thoughtfulness and formality, while that might take more time and maybe a little bit more expense because you're getting some guidance in what you put down, it's going to save a lot of time, stress, and expense on the back end when someone comes in and wants to understand why you did what you did.
Excellent wisdom, Hal. Thank you for that. I'm sure our listeners are grateful for that ending advice. The thing that people don't realize when enforcers come and look at what your organization has done, they're looking at that with the end in mind. They've got some reason why they're scrutinizing you or your organization. It usually involves some sort of an outlier in something. And they're trying to figure out, did finances cause this? So they look at your documents, they look at your deal documents, your emails, your text messages, with an eye towards why did this happen? And that's what people don't understand is there's a reason that we advise clients to get aligned on why we're doing the things that we're doing so that you can avoid a misperception down the road. Because if 99% of the organization's all on the same page and 1% don't get it, and that 1% puts in a text message that, hey, this is why we're doing this, DOJ is not going to put the 99% in their complaint. They're going to put the 1% that helps their case. That's just the way it works. You got to be aligned on this stuff. You got to be thoughtful about it. You got to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, but your whole organization understand it as well. And that's why, Hal, I'm really glad that we're teaming up here to talk about this issue, because I think this really is a big deal in healthcare, totally unlike any other industry. And so, Hal, I appreciate you joining the podcast and joining me in Louisville. This is a good week for healthcare compliance. So, Hal, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan, and looking forward to doing this together tomorrow.
To close, the tentacles of the False Claims Act are way, way, way bigger than what a lot of people think. There are some really big Supreme Court cert petitions that are coming up that could change the entire landscape of the False Claims Act. We're going to talk about those on this podcast. False Claims Act enforcement has the potential to end companies. It has the potential to change the way that entire industries do business. And so that's why I'm so happy to practice here at Husch Blackwell with people who think about these big, important topics. We're going to continue to bring you big, important topics on this podcast and so many others. But to our listeners, we appreciate you listening to us, and we'll see you next time.